All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening. My name is Pam Pearson. I'm the director and founder of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, and welcome to this Cryosphere Pavilion session on barriers to glacier-related financing, and a little bit later we'll get into solutions as well. I'm more known in these halls these days as sort of a purveyor and a bringer of cryosphere science into the negotiation since ICCI was founded in 2012. But if you go back further in my history, I was actually very involved in the environmental policies of the multilateral development banks. Back in the mid-90s, when I was also part of the Kyoto Agreement negotiation team with the United States. And as we began exploring the International Year of Glaciers Preservation, you see the logo right here, which is this year, it became more and more obvious that there was a bit of a gap, especially in the adaptation community, but also the mitigation community, about the importance of glacier and snowpack science to adaptation, to downstream uses, and that connection just was not really well understood. And coincidentally, thank goodness, at the same time, the Asian Development Bank was developing and finalizing its Glaciers to Farms program, which you'll hear about a little bit later in the panel. And so with ADB support over the past year, various people at ICCI have been working up what we call a white paper on barriers to glaciers-related financing. We began this effort with a meeting of several of the stakeholders the day after the launch of the year at the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva in January. And since then, there's been a very long consultation process. Susanna Hancock, who you'll be seeing in a moment, really led a lot of those consultations, including traveling to Washington, D.C. to meet with the GEF and the World Bank. And we've had the Green Climate Fund involved. We've had the Inter-American Development Bank involved. And so it really has been a very broad process. And BNP Paribas and some of the insurers as well have also been engaged, and we've really appreciated their support and their input into this process. And so without further ado, in terms of presenting the findings of this white paper, I want to introduce Dr. Susanna Hancock. She is ICCI's Global Mountains Director. I want to give a bit of a nod also to Dr. Miriam Jackson, who is a glaciologist and our Eurasia Director, who's been involved in this effort. But this has really become Susanna's baby, and we're really proud to present and release this white paper for the first time today.
Thank you very much, Pam. So glaciers around the world, along with snowpack, mountain, permafrost, are melting and disintegrating due to the rapidly warming climate. This melt is changing regional and the global hydrological cycles, as well as terrain stability. It's contributing to catastrophes with significant human toll. 3/4 of fresh water around the world is currently stored in the world's snow and ice. While the majority of this fresh water is held in the polar ice sheets, significant quantities are still within what we call the mountain cryosphere. That is the glaciers, snowpack, permafrost, and along with the frozen mountainsides in regions such as the Caucasus, Central, High Mountain Asia, the Andes here near us, the European Alps, and the North American caldera. In this white paper, just to clarify, we're using the word glaciers to be inclusive of the mountain cryosphere. This works. So this is the International Year of Glaciers Preservation, as Pam said. And the only way to preserve glaciers is swift emissions reductions aimed at or below our 1.5 degrees Paris Agreement limit. With such urgent action, some level of adaptation to deteriorating mountainsides and downstream conditions is paramount, as communities already face extensive loss and damage from glacier loss. Each fraction of a degree above today's level will lead to increased impacts, and as well as the need for further financing. So this is an example of a Glacier Lake outburst flood, just showing the power of these disasters. And here, again, we're seeing this again. So you can see how what we're seeing here is these upstream and these downstream impacts. All right. So 164 UN states are either glaciated or are impacted by the world's glaciers. For example, through changes in water flow for agriculture. Sea level rise currently is largely driven by the ice sheets in the polar regions rather than glaciers. So if all glaciers were to melt, we'd only have approximately half a meter of sea level rise to which they would contribute. Still, as much as 4 trillion in global GDP and numerous lives are at risk as a result of melting glaciers. Despite this, with very few exceptions, the global community is unprepared to meet these glacier-related changes. This white paper that we're going to be launching seeks to outline some of these largest hurdles to the glaciers and mountain cryosphere as related to financing. It identifies some of the needs and best practices globally to ensure that glaciers can preserve their vital role in preserving the world's water towers. And the slides can be available afterward as well for anybody. So understanding future projections of glaciers and snowpack, along with the needed adaptations, depends on emissions pathways. Adhering to our 1.5 trajectory saves more than twice as much ice as we would have along our current 2.7 trajectory. This really underscores the importance of mitigation throughout this whole process. Ice loss is accelerating between 2000 and 2023. Central Europe lost 39% of its glaciers, the Caucasus 35%, New Zealand 29%. Looking forward, in some areas, as you can see here, notably such as Scandinavia and Western North America, will lose all or nearly all of their ice committed at a temperature at or above 2 degrees centigrade. The Hindu Kush and Karakoram regions, previously considered to be amongst the most resilient to melt, if you've heard of the Karakoram anomaly, for example, stand to lose as much as 40% of current mass under that same 2-degree future. In the great water towers of central and eastern parts of high mountain Asia, 60% of today's mass is committed to being lost, even at a 1.5 emissions scenario, and that is again the lower limit set by the Paris Agreement. Thus, even with 1.5 degrees, steep losses will continue through at least mid-century. This will require adaptation planning and financing given decreasing ice stores as well as related to physical risks from landslides, GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods, and unpredictable water supplies for downstream needs, including agriculture, hydropower, and drinking water. So this is a glacier in the upper Indus Basin, Shotashigiri, and I'm just showing here a couple slides that will show a low emissions and a high emissions pathway. So this is today's year. And what we'll see is right now ice is very similar in loss, the glacier, but we rapidly start seeing how much more is preserved under a low emission scenario. So it's today's, is it 1.5? Yes. That's low emission, yes. Is that current trajectory? Yes. So that's what we will, so by century's end, which is only 75 years from now, and we're losing that much ice from where we started. All right. So unlocking financing for glaciers goes beyond many of the barriers that many of you experience with climate and adaptation finance in general, So some of these are familiar. We have challenges in accessing funding mechanisms. These may depend on an individual country's financial status, for example. We have political standstills, investor interests that drive funding, lack of collaboration between climate and financial organizations, not knowing what other groups need, and some even fewer, less perhaps familiar metrics in the case of something like nature-based solutions, which postdates many of the regulatory frameworks. Yet many of the gaps and the barriers are unique to this glacier environment. So for example, and I will say I have a handful of slides coming up that are very text heavy. I don't expect you to read all of those, don't worry. And again, as I said earlier, slides will be available for everybody to have if you would like. But just showing a few of these glacier-specific developments. Episodic nature of catastrophes, a lack of data, economic assessments that may not align, having bankable projects, clarity on what the regulations are, appropriate metrics and tools to assess risk, community level and indigenous knowledge, integration. And I have here, I've had competing disasters with capacity and urgency. And what I mean, I'll expand upon that actually. I'll expand upon that later. But then, and transboundary hazards. So this diagram here just shows a little bit of some of these different hazards when we're talking about glaciers, that we have a lot of competing issues to look at. It's a very holistic picture. So here, it's got unstable slopes and landslides, avalanches, social and infrastructure systems, floods, drought. And some of these are present, and some of these are in the future. All right. So the first one I want to focus on here is the episodic nature of catastrophes and glacier-related extreme events. Glacier-related events risks are complex. They are often cascading and have multi-hazards. Most notable are GLOFs, the glacier lake outburst floods that I mentioned earlier, for which 15 million people around the world are currently vulnerable. These can wipe out entire communities with very, very little warning. Another example is this idea of peak water, which is when basins experience changes in their water availability in relation to the snow and ice melt. So we may have excessive melts and rainfall that provides too much water at one period, and then that is followed later by not enough water and drought. In the short term or shorter term, this can create a lack of coherency with the timing of when we need water and when it's available. But in the long term, this means that we are preparing for a future of less water while currently living in a situation of too much. There are, of course, changes such as in monsoonal areas where we can still have excessive flooding during a period of drought. So it's not necessarily a transition from one to the other. Multi-hazards are currently not consistently fed into infrastructure design, and this means that it is lower likelihood that infrastructure or constructions will be able to withstand glacier-related impacts. Solutions may need to accommodate diverging scenarios. How do you create something for drought when you're currently experiencing an excess of water? How do you know that, how does drought become a priority, again, when you have too much water? This also means that infrastructure can be decommissioned prematurely, reducing cost efficacy. So this is just a couple slides on some of these examples. So this here is from the developed world. This is Switzerland last May, a very recent glacial impact, a collapse of a mountainside. It was well monitored, well studied, well known. They were able to do a full evacuation, including of the farming animals of the area. But here we see the town before this event, and here we see it afterward. And so this is one that was well monitored. It was predicted. As you can imagine, in many areas without these warnings, this doesn't happen. The saving people. And just on the peak water, so we can see here this timing of water runoff, that we gradually get more and more water until it reduces the amount that we get and less. So, and the last example here is from Pakistan. This is excessive flooding from a monsoon, but it's also augmented by rapid glacier melt. So again, all of these have multiple different contributing factors. Another risk for us is the lack of data on physical climate risks related to glaciers. We don't have data on key cryospheric indicators such as glacier mass balance, seasonal snow cover, permafrost thaw, downstream runoff in every area where we have glaciers and communities. Some of these glaciers may be difficult or challenging to access. Could be a result of geography or geopolitics. And data cannot be generalized from glacier basin to glacier basin. Each one needs to be understood and studied individually by itself, from the source to the sea. Uncertainty around the timing and magnitude of glacier retreat or water flow reductions hampers our ability to assess future risk and therefore design investment responses. Go into economic impact assessments. Many countries lack comprehensive assessments of the economic consequences of cryospheric loss, the effects of water availability, energy generation. Hydropower is a big source of energy in many mountainous communities. Agriculture, tourism, disaster risk. These are all, in many places, poorly quantified with how they relate to glaciers. And there are also few cost-benefit analyses available to support the case for adaptation investments or the deployment of glacier monitoring systems. So without qualification, glacier-related risks become invisible to funders. Cost-benefit evidence is necessary to justify adaptation spending in budget-constrained contexts. How do we apply a financial value or a time frame discount rate to a glacier? We also need to have a pipeline of bankable projects. There is currently a limited number of well-prepared, fundable projects that integrate glacier and climate-related risks. As often worked, glacier-related development is unlikely to draw a profit. This leaves a gap and creates something that's unpalatable for many investors. But this means that when we don't have a pipeline of bankable projects, the finance flow doesn't happen when there is funding. Donors and investors require clear business cases, measurable outcomes. Governments need to be able to shape markets, either making catalytic investments or supporting enabling conditions for investors. Policy and regulatory clarity. Unclear or inconsistent policy frameworks surround glacier protection, water management, and climate adaptation. This creates uncertainty for investors. Many national climate strategies do not yet include cryosphere-related risks. Moreover, some mechanisms, like nature-based solutions as related to glaciers, are not able to fit in many regulatory frameworks that currently exist. We know that investors need and want predictable policy environments if they're going to commit capital long term. And if cryosphere risks are not embedded in climate policy, then they cannot be prioritized in planning and funding. And solutions need to be supported by strong regulation in order to be trusted. Financial risk metrics and tools. There are a few financial tools or risk metrics specifically designed to account for such slow onset climate processes like glacier retreat or permafrost thaw. Most standard investment models are not equipped to handle these long-term and non-linear risks. Financial institutions avoid investing in areas where risk cannot be quantified or priced. Infrastructure and adaptation projects remain, therefore, underfunded or underinsured. Community level and Indigenous knowledge integration. Local and Indigenous knowledge systems are often overlooked in investment planning processes. Data collection efforts and investment designs rarely include this co-produced systems of knowledge that reflects the lived experiences and the priorities of the communities that are reliant on these cryospheric systems. Excluding local voices leads to poorly targeted, unsustainable, or even harmful investments at times. And community engagement increases the project effectiveness, legitimacy, and the long-term impact. We need to have local on-ground data to enhance accuracy and contextual relevance. And pooling resources can help amplify funding and also reduce redundancy. And then what I have here is competing urgent disasters with capacity and urgency, and that is just that in areas where we are experiencing rapid cryospheric changes and glacier loss tend to be areas that are experiencing other concurrent disasters. Poverty, food, water, political instability. And thus, it's often the case that glacier-related disasters are deprioritized. Glacier issues rapidly then become existential when they disrupt rivers, agriculture, economy, lives downstream. When we have one of those GLOFs that was not predicted and it wipes out an entire town. So fair financing mechanisms need to align with national realities. They need to be accessible to local control and tailored support. And the urgency and timelines of these glacier-related disasters need to be understood in order to be funded. And the last glacier-specific risk that I'm going to discuss here is just on the transboundary nature and transboundary hazards and the need for unification. Glaciers and watersheds are not usually, within geopolitical boundaries. They are, by nature, transboundary. Ideally, joint efforts for research, coordinated developments for bringing infrastructure together, shared goals and agreements on technical standards can be aligned, and they can come together to create strong outcomes. But in many cases, that is an ideal situation. So we need coordinated efforts to increase the efficiency and reduce redundancy. We need the mountain communities, although they've been punctuated by some successes as a group, to act in unison with a unified voice. And this has likely impacted their ability to mobilize finance thus far. We've seen groups such as AOSIS be able to access certain funds because they have come together as a united group. And then transboundary coordination that brings together intersectoral and interministerial coordination. We need to have finance ministers understand what the environment ministers are seeing. We need to be able to have the environment ministers understand what do the finance ministers need from us, because currently these are very siloed and not necessarily working together. So just to reiterate, 85% of countries that are currently here at COP30 are affected by glaciers, whether they are glaciated or whether it is a downstream impact. And without urgent action on these barriers to financing, many mountain and downstream communities are moving past the point of adaptation and into one of loss and damage. And we have a terrific panel here of people who are going to be speaking about many of the innovations and solutions to overcome these challenges. So I'm going to welcome them to do so and hope that that is all insightful for all of you. But before I do that, I will share that we are going to have this white paper. It is going to be published. It is not currently there, but you can take note of the address, icccinet.org/glaciers-finance, and it will be made available there. And lastly, I would just like to thank all of these incredible people who came together to help us with this, whether they met me or Pam, our team, remotely or in person in numerous places around the world, or whether they contributed as a reviewer. So very grateful to everybody. And then I will welcome our panel.
So hot.
But
I feel like I really have to take mine off, jeez.
Yes. So
Anyone can share my fan if you get too hot.
I think it's not that, it's just my ears. With these on, my ears are kind of like going,
Yeah. I think I'll be able to hear you guys. I might sit in the middle because then I can hear you.
Do you want the other screen on? That's a little. That's white. Okay. I'll give you that.
So part of the problem with the headset, when you
Yes, if you turn your head, you get interference.
no,
Okay. No, but you can turn your head as well. It's different in different areas.
yes.
okay, and you can sit on that side of the room, and you can sit absolutely still and get it.
Really? Good.
I was sitting on this side and it was okay when I was looking forward, but when I turned my head,
I think we might have to keep looking ahead. Right, where would you like to sit? Very good.
so perhaps we can actually, with the microphone,
Yeah.
I can hear one of them.
We can, with,
Maybe if you two in the middle go back a little
Yeah.
bit, and Noelle and I come forward a
Yeah,
little bit,
then
then
we
we
can
don't
go.
need, maybe
Yeah.
we don't need the headphones.
do you think if I keep the one and then we pass it around for the audience, we can do that so we can all hear each other? Does that work for you guys?
Yeah.
Do you want to do that? So we take them off as panelists. Yeah. We take it off and then can you hear us? Okay, great. So, like there? Further?
But also, one option
Yeah, you could also move closer if you need to, but no, we'll keep it there. Okay, so, right, everyone can hear us? We're good? Okay, excellent. And you, all three of you can hear me. Okay, brilliant. If anyone gets too hot, you can borrow my fan, so don't worry about that. And thank you so much, Susanna and Pam. I think your leadership on this topic is absolutely exemplary when it comes to how science can collaborate across with industry and with different experts from all regions across the world. I think, just for background, so my role is I lead sustainable finance engagement within BNP Paribas. So we're the largest bank in Europe, but we also were one of the kind of early movers when it came to sustainable finance innovation, and particularly on adaptation. I remember going to the COP in Dubai and meeting some of Pam's team and saying, we really need to get this topic around adaptation finance much higher on the agenda, and it's been a core focus area. So I would like to introduce our fellow panelists. So I'm going to start to the left of me with Nancy. So Nancy Sage is the Chief Climate Change Expert at the European Investment Bank. She's got decades of experience in this space, and particularly leading on EIB's efforts around sustainable finance to drive both the mitigation agenda and very increasingly the adaptation agenda. I think EIB's been a real leader in that space, both in Europe and more internationally as well outside of the region. To my right is Marika Reuter, the Head of Sustainability Strategy at AXA Group. So that includes all of the various arms of AXA and is based in Paris. And has been working very closely with us on COP here and also on the UN Ocean Conference. So I think AXA has been really taking a leading role in multiple biomes, and particularly on the physical risk side of ocean as well, which was mentioned by Susanna. And last but absolutely by no means least, we have Noelle O'Brien, who's the Director of Climate Change Change at the Asian Development Bank, and has been really at the forefront of this topic. And I think Noel's going to share examples of some of the work from ADB's side on the Glacier to Farms initiative in particular, which I think is really quite pioneering in the way that you're mainstreaming finance for glacier issues. So in terms of kind of the overview today for the panel, we wanted to try and look at, Susanna set the scene with that amazing scientific overview, and I think really concrete facts around the translation of physical risk into financial risk and into kind of societal risk as well. I think we shouldn't forget that these glacier regions have a lot of people for context. I think, the areas that we're talking about, glaciers, not everyone's seen a glacier necessarily, but they affect everyone's lives, to your point on some of the data in the paper. We can see that there's, huge water impacts. I think billions of people rely on those water streams that come from glaciers, and even in Switzerland, I think what was amazing, Susanna, about your examples is they're both from emerging markets and developed markets. So this is really a global issue, but we have to localize the solutions to that. So maybe just starting first, I think with you, I think, Noel, would be great. So from your perspective, what risks does some of this glacier loss pose to the Asia region and some of the regions that you're operating in, particularly the Hindu Kush Himalayas, the HKH, and how is the Glacier to Farms program helping address this? Maybe you can share a bit more information about the program as well.
No, thank you very much.
Shall we move closer?
Okay, thank you. I just saw blank faces. Thank you. Maybe I'll just begin because we've seen some images here, but for ADB, we were directly involved in the Malamshi investment in Kathmandu. This was over $500 million investment in a new water intake supply system for Kathmandu, Nepal. And it was 2 weeks before opening, there was a major glacial lake outburst that covered all of the intake, and so this really had an enormous impact. ADB and the government of Nepal started to excavate with that, but then there was additional debris, and so that investment sits currently a question of what is to be done. So this was where ADB had a really direct understanding that just how much glacial melt can impact on our investments. So let me just so one of the things as a result of that development, we have a technical assistance investment in the Hindu Kush Himalayas, which is known as the BAR-KH, that is focused on Nepal and Bhutan right now. But then the Glaciers to Farms program, this really takes a transformative and systems-based approach, following on from many of the aspects that were addressed on the white paper. It holistically covers the climate risks from upstream glacier-fed river systems to downstream ecosystems to ensure that we have identification and design of appropriate resilient investment that combines infrastructure and nature-based solutions that are informed by effective science-based planning and investment programming that aims to strengthen the resilience of mountain and rural communities. Through the glacier risk assessment supported by GCF Project Preparation Facility, an initial analysis of glacier melt impact across 4 of the key watersheds, the Narin, the Kura, the Pianj, and the Swat. We were able to prepare that work, and that served as the foundation for developing an indicative pipeline for interventions under the G2F. And some of those, it's addressing the accelerated glacier retreat, it's reducing high altitude ice reserves, threatening long-term water supplies for agriculture, hydropower, and downstream communities. We're seeing the hydrological disasters increasing, as I mentioned, a sharp rise in gloughs, flash floods, debris flows, landslides, mud flows, and avalanches due to the rapid melt and shifting precipitation. We're seeing a shift in the seasonal water time with earlier spring runoff and reduced late summer water availability, and this is creating mismatches with peak irrigation demand. We're seeing the permafrost degradation, which is causing slope instability, increasing in sediment loads, mass wasting events, and the potential potential release of the legacy pollutants that threaten water quality. And of course, we're seeing higher sedimentation from the unstable glaciers and thawing permafrost. And this is causing reservoir siltation, damaging hydropower and irrigation infrastructure, and reducing the efficiency and lifespan. We just currently actually have a team not in the G2F region, but in Punsaling in Bhutan, trying to understand the implications of slope stabilization. But the G2F, it's a 10-year program. It covers 9 of ADB's developing member countries in Central and West Asia. So specifically being Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, and then the 5 states of Central Asia: Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And it addresses barriers across policy and institution, technology, infrastructure, social services. And it will invest in modernized irrigation, watershed management, water-efficient technologies, early warning systems, adaptive social protection schemes, and health systems. So recognizing that glacial melt and climate change more broadly transcend the national borders, as we've already heard, G2F will promote regional dialogue and cooperation. And of course, the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program, CARIC, and particularly the Climate Change and Water Pillar working groups will serve as a key platform to advance regional discourse on water cooperation, investment identification, and exchange of knowledge and best practices. So overall, the G2F is about building resilient systems and partnerships that secure water and food for over 380 million people across the region, ensuring that adaptation and resilience are achieved collectively and sustainably. So maybe I'll leave it there and come back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And bit of a clap there. Thank you so much. And I think in everything that you say there's really a kind of coherence with the broader financial industry discussion around physical risk. I've been to 6 COPs now, and I think this is the COP where there's much more pragmatism around adaptation financing, and particularly the translation of physical risk into how some of the investments can be addressed. And I think the leadership that your team's showing on that with the Glacier to Farms is really interesting, and thank you for sharing. Maybe Nancy, I could turn to you. So, EIB has really taken a really strong kind of stance when it comes to many of the issues that Nancy also mentioned. And I think particularly on adaptation, I think obviously, as the climate bank of the EU, the EIB is doing a lot of work on the mitigation side, trying to keep within some of the scenarios that the glacier shots showed by Susanna. But you've also, in your latest climate strategy, got plans to increase to 30 billion of adaptation finance by 2030. So how are you incorporating many of these kind of adaptation imperatives into the bank's climate strategy, both in Europe and also maybe more internationally as well outside of the region?
Thank you. Is this working? Okay. Because I can't hear myself now, so that's a little odd.
I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting the EIB here. I'm going to say something that will be very boring to Noelle, because she's probably heard me say it every time I've opened my mouth at this COP. But I think it's particularly relevant here in this Cryosphere pavilion. And that is, so we are the EIB, European Investment Bank. We're owned by the EU. We operate in the EU and in developing countries all around the world. We do about 90 to 100 billion euro financing a year. So that 10% in developing countries and emerging economies is about 9 to 10 billion euro a year. We are the climate bank, and we have developed a new 5-year strategy following on from our 2021 to 25 one. We now have 2026 to 2030. And as well as indeed staying the course and maintaining our ambition on climate and nature and environment, I want to highlight that although we are we call ourselves the climate bank, actually the targets that we're looking at and the priorities are climate and environment. But within that, doubling adaptation finance as an aggregate to 2030. But very importantly, we have a new mission statement updated from our previous one. This new mission statement brings in nature as well as climate change. And it also, again, repeats that we are strategically aligned with the 1.5 degrees temperature goal. And I think that it's incredibly important to highlight the fact that, you know, you can do as much adaptation as you can, and you can focus on the most vulnerable, and you can try and be proactive, and you can do integration of climate change impacts and climate risks into all your projects and support your clients on that. But if we don't also stay focused on mitigation as well, then there's stuff that we just will reach a point, as we saw, where the ice will be all gone. And then there's no water flow in the spring, right? So, and we may just not be able to make that infrastructure that's downstream, you know, able to adapt. So I think that has really resonated with me, and actually, I mean, my normal example that I give from the special report on 1.5 degrees C is that the difference between well below 2 and 1.5 is the loss of most warm water coral and all warm water coral, which is a critically important thing which people seem to really understand, and strangely they seem to react more than telling them how many millions of people will, you know, be affected, migrate or die. But somehow coral reefs, they seem to understand that cannot be good for anybody. But I think what I now have from this, and I'm looking forward to the report, is another example that actually it's the difference between the loss of a lot of the ice and in some regions all of the ice, and that is the water also. So I really think that I just want to say that we have to do both. Now, when we come to look at the specifics of these catastrophic events, as you said, if you have some information, if you have warning systems, you may be able to limit the loss of life. You may not be able to avoid the damage to the fixed infrastructure, but you may be able to move the movable assets. You may be able to move the trains, move the buses, and most importantly, move the people and their farm animals and so on, as we saw Switzerland was able to do. And I remember well the photos of the cows in the slings being moved off these beautiful pastures, which look absolutely lovely and probably have looked like that for thousands of years, and they don't look like that anymore, as we saw from the picture. So why is that also important, in particular when we think about the whole energy system? As we electrify more of our industry, and as we become more reliable on one source of power, which is electricity, it becomes even more important that that electricity system is climate resilient, because we have less flexibility, shall we say. And therefore there's been some very important work done by OECD in 2022. The International Energy Agency has been looking at that this year, that the critical importance of climate resilience in the energy system. And I think the difference is we've always understood that hydropower is doubly vulnerable to both low flow and therefore low power generation, and high flow, and therefore, the issues of the danger of overtopping and so on. But what we see from the glacier situation is you have a third case, which is literally catastrophic loss of all infrastructure and probably the downstream infrastructure as well. So it brings an added thing, and it makes me think about the early warning systems for all, which is basically and very importantly about weather systems. But clearly what we need here is early warning systems on glaciers. How do we do that? I'm sure that you've been doing financing of that, and I certainly wouldn't suggest that EIB knows about that, but I think that it's something for us to be aware of, because you cannot quantify it. We do not have an economic model that will adequately sort of put this in. An incredibly high impact, I wouldn't say low probability, but lower probability, and very, very difficult to predict event unless you have good warning systems. But those seems to be important. The next thing I want to say is obviously all of this is going to exacerbate the water issues, and therefore it's going to doubly exacerbate the vulnerability, but not only of people but also of businesses. Many sectors are very water dependent, and this issue is not only about farming, it's also about other industries. So that is a double vulnerability. But as you mentioned in the opening, often this is in another country. The vulnerable people and businesses may not be in the place where the catastrophic event is going to take place. So it really requires sort of catastrophic risk approach in a region, a mountainous region. Again, not something that we're always terribly good at doing. And yet we have good examples, for example, how the Caribbean islands work together to have a resilient system across the islands, similarly Pacific systems. We need to probably develop those risk management systems per mountain range rather than per country. And the last thing I want to do is really reiterate that we are looking not only to have a big bag of money. We're obviously a bank, so we like to lend money. But most importantly, in our new strategy, we have highlighted that we want to finance where it matters most, and we want to support most vulnerable places, people, businesses. We also want to support LDCs and SIDS in particular. But I think what this has shown me is that in our own backyard, which is Europe, and we have the Alps, Switzerland obviously is not an EU member state, but it is part of the European system. And in pretty much every region in the world where we are working, whether it's Latin America, where we also do a lot, Asia, where we often co-finance with ADB, Africa, I'm not sure there's glacial, but maybe there is, I'm thinking there is, yes, I thought there probably was. It's basically a global issue, and so I really look forward to taking this information back to our teams. I'm sure the water people are well aware, but really working together to see how can we look at this mountain range regional approach and the early warning systems on glaciers. I hope there's something we can do, and I really look forward to that.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for your kind of comprehensive leadership on that issue. I think I will certainly kind of take that away on my side to kind of mobilise on the financial industry space, and I think Pam and Susanna and the team have really got that kind of, well, firstly credibility as scientists. So you mentioned some of the models for the early warning systems. I think a lot of that data does exist within the scientific community, and I think it's about building these bridges or ladders, if we're looking at glaciers and crevasses, to be able to create that kind of discussion. Really, I love what you said about saying it mountain range by mountain range. Random side note, but outside of work I run an NGO on sustainable mountain tourism, and a lot of my focus is on the Alps, and what I've seen is that issue is so prevalent for mountain communities in the Alps. We've been to Chamonix, we've been to major places where those mountain communities exist, but even there, one mountain, one side of Mont Blanc Chamonix and the other's Courmayeur, and they're talking a completely different issue. One has a tourism issue, and the other one has an issue around air pollution due to traffic of a tunnel. So I think the localization of the issue is a strength in a way, because it creates types of financial solutions that could address the issue. But then I think more broadly, this inter-mountain collaboration, I don't know what the right word is, Pam, but inter kind of cryosphere collaboration is really necessary.
Yeah. just one thing to add to that. You may have heard about SOF, which is the Systemic Observations Financing Facility, which is about weather monitoring stations. And obviously, the poorer the country, the less weather stations you have. I imagine that it's probably similar in terms of the glacier systems. And so I think it's probably an area where we can really think how just adding one or two monitoring stations in areas that have none could have a huge impact in terms of reducing vulnerability of the energy systems, the people downstream. And yet, you know, we have to be careful that we don't end up focusing only on the wealthy and middle income because they have so many assets at risk, when actually there are places where there are no warning systems at all, like with the weather systems.
That's a really great point, and I think Pam and team released the State of the Cryosphere report, if I understand correctly, and I think, you know, some of that data collection piece was so critical there, and I think it's a key recommendation, if I remember correctly. Maybe turning on to more of the investment side, Marika. You know, AXA is really, again, similar to the MDB space, but taking a real leadership on addressing some of the physical risk side of the issue. So, you know, even more broadly, if we look at the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, globally, that's huge. I mean, it's that billions of assets under management are now kind of within that nature-related disclosure space. I think the latest figures from our team, sorry, I was just trying to look at it on my iPad, I'm going to flick it through. Oh, there we go. $7.7 trillion of assets under management are within the TNFD. And yet, when I speak to people on the TNFD, you know, the bank, I remember being on the TNFD when it was a Zoom call. Literally, it was really kind of the forefront of the time. And yet, even now, when I speak to people on TNFD, there's a real lack of relation to the water issue, to Cryosphere. So I think this project is hopefully helping bridge that. So how is AXA kind of assessing and pricing some of that physical risk when it comes to key issues like water resilience, sea level rise, and what kind of approaches can we learn from as a broader industry on that?
Sure thing. Can you hear me? Because I can't hear myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we can maybe, oh God, are you okay?
Okay.
I'm
So
going to rotate the chair.
what we've done, the general approach at AXA is that we have an in-house team who carry out research, modeling, analysis, and this helps us with, you know, while working with best-in-class external providers to cover all the risks that we cover. And we're also working with regulators to carry out climate stress tests, and that helps us better understand the impacts of climate change and also improve our risk management framework. So that's more of a general overview. And then when you look at physical risks, basically physical risks which are related to wealth hazards are the risks among which we are most interested in as insurers. We see climate change as an amplifier of these physical risks. And looking to our business, if we look at the property and casualty business of AXA, basically the most significant risk that we face, that we anticipate to face by 2050, is going to be increasing temperatures, excessive rainfall, but also increasing sea levels. So I think that's interesting. And then going to your second point about, you know, what approaches could inspire us in this specific case, like what does the industry, what does the insurance industry look at and what they can provide in terms of tools. So I mean, I see risk assessment tools as one lever, but also risk transfer products. And when we look at risk assessment tools, I'm going to go back to the topic of oceans that you were mentioning earlier. Basically with ORA, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Alliance, we developed the Coastal Risk Index. And this is a modeling tool which helps identify the risks for coastal areas. And in this case, you know, we've been able to identify what is at stake for oceans, and we're talking about $360 billion of coastal risk assets at risk in the case where there are no natural defenses. And also the effect on actually communities. Over 14 million people would be affected in addition to what is already the case today if there were no wetlands, mangroves and such. So that's kind of the tool that maybe could be developed as well on the high mountain areas that you were mentioning earlier, something more specific to that. I think another example as well in terms of products now is the parametric insurance program. And so this is a bit different from traditional insurance programs because basically it's it's triggered by certain events. We're talking about excessive rainfall, wind speed, and I can give you an example just to highlight what we're talking about. So there's the Mangrove Conservation and Restoration Project in Mexico that we've been backing. And what's interesting with this project is basically we're helping the fishing community locally. So it's basically a community that doesn't have a lot of means, but they are doing interesting work in terms of marine conservation when it comes to mangroves. They have actually 800 hectares that they on the ground take care of, and this has actually given them the opportunity to certify their work through the Blue Carbon Credit program in Mexico, recognized program in there. And in our case, what we're doing is we're actually providing insurance so that when, for example, there's a hurricane that comes through, they can easily access a payout of up to $100,000, and this can be triggered in a couple of days, which is honestly necessary when you know that it's a fishing community and they rely on these mangroves for their livelihoods. And so this is where you demonstrate that there is both an economic and also an environmental aspect that is taken into consideration. And so same, I mean, I don't know what we can do on the high mountain front, but that could be an interesting thing to look at as well. Another one going more about unlocking capital. So I think what's interesting to have in mind is that AXA, we work a lot with MDBs through our branch AXA XL. And the idea is to provide credit insurance or political risk insurance in certain cases. And just to highlight one example, it has to do with nature, so debt for nature swaps. There's one in the Bahamas, which is interesting. It's basically a debt conversion program whereby the Bahamas are reducing their debt and at the same time committing to marine conservation efforts. And what I find most interesting is by providing these loans, by providing this insurance, they're enabled to unlock $124 million for marine conservation, and this is over 15 years. We're talking about protecting 3,500 kilometers of coastline. I'm not sure how many islands, but I do have this image of it's very odd, but flamingos. I have 80,000 flamingos in my mind because that was one of the outcomes for this project. And going back to the loan that was provided, this was provided by Standard Chartered Bank, and they explained that the fact that AXA provided this credit insurance enabled them actually to provide this loan. So it's kind of an enabler, and at the same time, we're not behind the project. We just have a catalytical role. And so I think one thing that's interesting in whatever project, and sometimes insurers are kind of left aside, we're seen as the people who arrive when an event happens. I think one thing that's interesting, and I've heard it a lot actually at COP since I've been here, it could be interesting to pull in insurers ahead of time and try and figure out what kind of schemes can be set up because they have a better view of the risks that we face today, but also tomorrow. Even if, and this is an if, we talk about physical risks, but what's difficult with the future is that we have a number of additional risks that we don't necessarily always had to consider. Transition risk, for example, is being more and more developed, and that's linked to policy, technology, consumer preferences. So that's something we have to take into account in addition to that. And also, more recently, increasingly, litigation risks. So I think those are a few examples of where perhaps in addition to what you were saying about the early warning systems, because that's also something we work on, that could be, avenues that could be adapted to the cryosphere space.
That's great, and I love the perspective on some of that innovation side of what can be done from parametric to some of the kind of blended finance structures. Maybe just turning, Noelle, to you. So how do you see some of those sustainable finance approaches that Marika talked about? And on our side, we're really active on the sustainable capital markets front, from use of proceeds bonds to address this. I think we've only probably got about how long? Okay, great. So we'll probably spend like 5 or so minutes on this section, but just on the solution side. So, there's a development of use of proceeds instruments, KPI-linked instruments, outcome-based finance. How does ADB see some of this sustainable finance evolution to approach, adaptation and water resilience project?
Thank you, and thank you to Pam and the ICCI team for all the engagement with ADB on this work. and I will wrap up in like maybe in 10 minutes because I go across to the Pacific Pavilion to actually to moderate a session with the 4 atoll countries. So for which every centimeter of sea level rise, it's absolutely, it impacts every minute of their day. Sustainable finance. So, and just joined us was the Glaciers to Farms initiative, which has just been an initiative. An initiative by ADB, together with the GCF, to help unlock capital for investment in Central and West Asia. So we feel that with this initiative, we are demonstrating that glacial resilience can be turned into investable opportunity, linking both public and private participation. So basically what has happened with this is we have 250 million of concessional finance from the GCF, predominantly grant, but some soft loans, and we feel that will allow us to bring together a blended financial option. The expectation is that ADB will bring at least 3.2 billion of our own investment resources, and this will allow us to de-risk early adaptation investments, but to also attract other investors who would traditionally avoid climate and water projects. So some of this will be done in terms of helping with the analytics. In some of our middle income countries, they are not naturally trending towards this kind of investment, but with the GCF funding, it will allow us to give greater concessionality, and that will be a really important part in bringing them to investments. And then there's the exploring innovative tools like the sustainability-linked bond, the outcome-based financing, and payments for ecosystem services. So those are some of the critical aspects, and obviously the work we've been doing with BNP Paribas on resilience bonds and the potential to do something specific around glacier bonds is absolutely key on that. So I'll wrap it up there because of time.
Thank you so much, Noelle, and for being so comprehensive in that. And maybe turning to you, Nancy, how do you see the role of some of that sustainable finance innovation to unlock particularly institutional capital to kind of water, resilience, infrastructure issues, and especially in glacier-related regions? And I'm also conscious of the time because we have to hand over in a minute.
First thing I would say is obviously we're the EU bank. The EU taxonomy has 6 objectives. It's not just a climate one. It has 4 environmental ones. Water is one of them, along with biodiversity, depollution, and circular economy. And obviously the water one is closely linked with the nature one, is closely linked with the adaptation and mitigation objectives. So it's very much an area where you get sort of win-win opportunities in the sustainable finance area. And I think it's just a question of really building on the taxonomy and pushing forward the opportunity for green bond issuance and so on. I think obviously it's good AXA are here because clearly the insurance industry has an important role to play here as well. And the other thing I would say though is we talk a lot about catastrophe bonds. It may be that this is an area which has to be thought about as well. And I think that we could do some joint learning as well and try and bring the glacier water discussion into some of these other discussions that are going on, as you mentioned, for coastal regions or where there are these other sort of very extreme hazards, and start to think, are there some synergies, are there some financial instruments that are being developed that could be then applied and extended into this mountain space, and I look forward to following that up. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And maybe Marika, just kind of ending with you before we hand over to the colleague from Tajikistan government that's been leading a lot of work. You know, the International Year of Glacier Conference was in Dushanbe, and I think you're going to share some insights on that. From AXA's perspective, how do you see, you know, some of that collaboration work across, you know, the industry, the science community, some of the MDBs and others that are trying to address many of these cryosphere-related issues on water and physical risk?
So I think I say starting off that, you know, for AXA we believe that actions linked to the blue economy need to be adopted with a scientific approach. And so going to that, actually, we founded the AXA Research Fund in 2008, and that has enabled to fund a number of projects, 700 projects. I think it's 300 million euros over these past 17 years. In any case, what I think is interesting in terms of what the topic at hand that we see is that we actually have an Antarctica expedition, and so there's a glaciologist and an explorer who are involved, and they're currently... Yeah, Heidi Sylvestre right now. I think it's their 13th day. We're talking about 3,600 kilometers in 80 days, and basically it's a kite ski crossing of Antarctica. And what's interesting here is that basically they're going to be towing 2 ground penetrating radars to map the ice layers beneath the surface, and so that will inform going forward what actions could be taken. So this is one example I thought was linked more precisely beyond the 700 projects, but yeah, we'll definitely continue on doing that.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, of course.
This may be completely mad off the top of my head, but we're looking at all sorts of solutions in the toolbox now, right? And of course, there's a lot of discussions about how we're going to get CO2 out of the atmosphere, because we know there's overshoot. And I don't want to go into that, but I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for innovation here in slowing down the impact on glaciers. Is there anything? I know that sounds completely mad, but maybe there's some kind of artificial cloud that you can make that, they're talking about it in the Arctic. Could it help in glaciers? I don't know, just to slow it down a bit, give us a bit more time. I'm sure there's some bright young person in a university, you're shaking your head, that's just kind of trying to think.
I think that geoengineering is quite controversial in the cryosphere space. I was at President Macron's One Planet Summit, and it kind of was quite a contentious issue, but I agree that there's lots of innovation that can be done on those physical risk solutions, and I think it's about kind of inter-industry collaboration. I see it in 4 ways: water, food security, heat and health, and resilient infrastructure. And I think if we apply that framework in a cryosphere glacier context, it could be potentially quite powerful, and it aligns with a lot of what everyone's discussing.
Maybe then what we need is something that's equivalent to mangroves in terms of slowing down the impact of the catastrophic flows. Maybe there are some things we can think of downstream of the glacier that could reduce the impact. I don't know, I think these things are so huge and their impact are so impactful on people that it's worth a bit of thinking what could be done.
Yeah, and I think you can just leverage. I was talking about the fishing community in Mexico, and they led a lot of conservation efforts. So you could you could just try and leverage the people who are actually living in the mountains, who are really, they want it to be restored, maintained, protected. Yes, they have the knowledge.
And maybe just ending, there is a lot of examples of that physical infrastructure investment required, and I think solutions are available, but it's about mobilizing and scaling. I'm going to hand over to the... Oh, sorry? Oh, okay. Yeah? Did you want us to do a photo? Yeah, I think, should we do a photograph with you as well? Because I think Noelle's going to leave, and then I'll hand over to Pam to do the introduction for you.
Turikul, I think the man should be in the middle. Yeah. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We'll give you a chance to get somewhere where the static is not so bad, eh? Yeah. So thank you all so much. And I will just say a bit of a word in terms of what can be done locally. The first thing that you mentioned, CDR, is really the only thing that's going to help, and that's a very difficult message, but you know, that's been looked at permafrost, it's been looked at glaciers. We need to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere to bring temperature down. Geoengineering actually is not at all controversial in the cryosphere community. It's been rejected. There's a very small group of people who are pushing it forward, but unfortunately there was a very large consensus paper that came out just a couple of months ago saying, you know, sorry, yeah. But the methods that involve CDR can pull down temperatures actually relatively quickly. That's where we need the innovation. The one local thing, two local things only that we know of, irrigation, oddly enough, looks like it has decreased the amount of glacier loss because you have more moisture in the atmosphere close to glaciers. And the other, of course, which I think everyone is aware of here, is black carbon emissions. So things like cook stoves, use of fire in agriculture, diesel transport, and so on, close to glaciers or downwind of glaciers, that also can help to preserve them. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome for just a few closing words Mr. Turakul Mamadov, one of our wonderful colleagues from Tajikistan, the Committee on Environmental Protection, or the Environment Ministry, to say a few last words about the importance of preserving glaciers and to adapt to that part of their loss that is not that is inevitable.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much, colleagues. Really, I think today was very interesting and useful discussion among esteemed panelists. And first of all, I would like to express our appreciation, of course, for inviting me, and also for our esteemed panelists for sharing, for discussing this very important topic issue related to glacier and also innovation and necessity of mobilizing of financial resources. As we come to the close of this important side event, I would like to extend my sincere appreciation once again to all participants and for our panelists for their thoughtful contribution and their unwavering commitment to safeguarding one of the Earth's most vital and fragile resources, glaciers. Today's discussion has reinforced a truth we can no longer ignore. The preservation of glaciers is not only an environmental necessity, it is a matter of global water security, disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, and intergenerational justice. Our dialogue builds upon the momentum generated by the Dushanbe High-Level International Conference on Glacier Preservation, which was hosted by Tajikistan in end of May of this year. The conference produced several key outcomes that must guide actions moving forward. First, to reaffirm glacier as shared global heritage. Should I continue? It's okay? Yeah, thank you. So the Dushanbe conference produced several key outcomes that must guide our actions moving forward. First, it's the reaffirm glacier as shared global heritage whose loss would profoundly affect millions of people, particularly those living in mountain regions and downstream communities who depend on glacier-fed rivers for drinking water, agriculture, energy, and livelihood. The second, the conference underscored the glacier melt is accelerating faster than previously predicted, intensifying the urgency for coordinated global responses that combine scientific research, adaptation strategies, and community resilience. The third, perhaps most critically, Dushanbe emphasized the central role of sustainable and predictable financing. Without dedicated resources, national, regional, and international, our commitments will remain aspirations rather than actions. We heard clear calls for innovative financing mechanisms, including climate adaptation funds, blended financing models, and partnership with the private sector to ensure long-term support for glacier monitoring, early warning system, and integrated water resource management. Our conversation today echo and amplifies those outcomes. We have seen that financing glacier preservation is not a cost, it is an investment in stability, resilience, and shared prosperity. When we preserve glaciers, we preserve ecosystem, we preserve culture, we preserve peace. As we conclude, let us carry forward the spirit of Dushanbe, collaborative, scientific-based, and action-oriented. Let us continue to champion glacier preservation as a core pillar of climate resilience. And let us do so with the conviction that together, with adequate financing and sustained political will, we can protect these irreplaceable natural treasures before it is too late. Thank you all for your engagement and your dedication. Let this not be the end of our discussion, but the beginning of renewed commitment and collective action. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone here. We're going to need to move off for the next side event, but we really appreciate all of our speakers, our panelists, and let's continue for the rest of this COP to really raise the need for ambition and adaptation both. So thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
Oh yeah. That's the only thing. I mean, there were so many other things I could say, but they all sounded so negative. I thought I won't go there. Like the fact that most infrastructure, including all this infrastructure that we're trying to raise finance.